Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to tonight's episode of NTV Europe's celebrity talk show, Talking Point. I'm your host, Syed Neaz Ahmed. In our studios today, we have been lucky to find and get Mr. Ian D. Richardson. He is a well-known journalist, broadcast journalist. He has worked with BBC. Presently, he is writing. He has written a number of books, and two of his books we will be discussing today. Apart from that, we'll be discussing a lot of things. He has been in China, and he has seen world leaders from a very close quarter. So we will talk to him about his experience and the world today and the world that is going to be tomorrow. Thank you. Ian, how are you today?
Fine, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm grateful to you, honored that you were able to come today despite the very cold weather.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Ian, you started your life very early as a writer. As there is I saw a picture on your website, or probably blog, that you have raised your raised feet, you have reached a typewriter, you're trying to tap away something. Do you remember what it was?
Well, I can't remember what it was, of course, but I think I was 4 years old. But it was my dad's typewriter. He was the editor of the local newspaper. And I guess, like a lot of young children, particularly boys, they want to be like their dad. So I was trying my luck at typing. I have no idea what I wrote. It was probably rubbish.
Or twinkle, twinkle. You said your dad was editor of a local newspaper, so I won't be wrong if I said that journalism and writing runs in the genes.
Well, I think it does, but strangely enough, I never intended to be involved in journalism. I worked after school in the small town in the Australian bush where we lived. After school, I worked for a watchmaker, and I used to repair clocks and well, I didn't do the watches. That was the clever stuff. My boss did that, but I did some of the clocks and things, and I was planning to be a watchmaker, and the apprenticeship was all set up and everything. Then my father came in one day and had a word to the watchmaker, and next thing I knew was that I was being told that, well, I'm sorry, your father needs you in the newspaper business and printing business, and I'm not able to offer you a watchmaker's apprenticeship. So what I didn't know then was that my father was dying, and that's why he wanted me to go into the business. He needed him.
And that was the time to move.
Yes, to help. And so after he died from cancer, my mother took the business over, and I continued and worked with the newspaper.
What was your age then?
I think I was 16. Yeah, so I was very young, because these days people don't leave school so early. But no, I left school when I was 16 to begin my printing apprenticeship, and then I learnt journalism as I went along. And when my mother, in a moment of madness, bought 2 more newspapers, she didn't have anyone to run them, so I was then 19.
And you were the chief editor.
And suddenly I became editor of a small paper called the Quambatook Times, and another one, the Manangatang Courier, at 19. So, and that was my experience in my early days of journalism.
Yep. What was your first story that you did? Knew the story?
Well, It's difficult, difficult to remember, of course, but one story that does stick out in my mind was that I did this article, which I saw recently in an old file, about Sputnik.
Yeah.
So how everyone was outside in the town watching Sputnik
Yeah, the
go
Russian
over.
ones.
So there was that, and I think I sometimes got a bit what they call bolshy too. I wrote a few stories complaining about things and in the town and how they should be improved, but my mother was very tolerant and just let me get on with it.
Well, you love writing, as I understand, and you grew up in a house which was full of newspapers and people talking about journalism and all that. And you worked for some other newspapers or broadcasting companies in Australia.
Yes, well, my mother remarried and it was decided to sell our newspapers. And I had been working part-time for a commercial radio station in a gold mining city, a former gold mining city called Bendigo. And I was offered a job on the local radio station. Called Radio 3BO Bendigo, and that was my first real experience of journalism, because up to that point I'd been learning myself.
Yeah.
I was learning on the job, whereas when I got to Bendigo I worked for a wonderful editor called David Horsfall, who actually taught me what I should be doing and taught me about broadcast journalism. And while I was in Bendigo I met my wife, Rosemary.
Great. Nice place to meet her.
Yes, it was. It was wonderful.
It's a former gold mining
yes,
city.
well, we met in a...
You found the gold anyway.
No, I never found any. Well, I did in that respect, yes. Yes, no, we met in the Carlos and Rosita ballroom in Bendigo.
When you came over to London, you said that was in 1968, isn't it?
That's right.
And you joined BBC.
Yes, well, I had a few jobs, various jobs, part-time jobs, and then the BBC offered me a job for 3 months working as a sub-editor at BBC World Service, then at Bush House in London. And that 3 months went on for 27 years.
All this time were you with the Bush House in Bush House?
No, I was with Bush House most of the time, but then in 1991, World Service Television News, which later became BBC World News, was being set up, and I had been in charge of the World Service foreign correspondence, and I'd been doing a little bit of work for the start-up, but eventually I was asked would I move to Television Centre full-time, and that's what I did for the first 2 or 3 years. Then they wanted to set up Arabic television, and so I was called away to do that.
Oh, I was looking forward to exchange a few pleasantries with you in Arabic, but as you said that you didn't, you had it twice.
Well, the truth is that I was given 3 months to set up Arabic television.
Right.
I mean, I had other people doing it with me, but if it hadn't been set up, it would have been my fault. That's a very, very short time to set up a television network on that scale.
Or to learn a language.
And to learn a language, and I understand Arabic is not all that easy.
Yep.
And so someone said to me, well, are you going to learn Arabic, Ian? And I said, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to learn Arabic, or do you want me to get this channel on air? And so it was a no-brainer, really. I learnt a few words of Arabic.
Where was it based?
That was based in Television Centre in Shepherd's Bush, alongside BBC World Television.
Right. When did you arrive in China, in Beijing?
Well, that was actually when I was still working at Bush House. Part of my job was then going out as what you might call a field manager with the big stories, and I would be taking a team along with me, and we'd go into an area where there was a big story, a city where there was a big story, and I'd have to do that. But one of the main jobs I used to do was follow Gorbachev around when he had all these summit meetings. Now, in 1989, he was off to Beijing to meet the Chinese leadership, and that was when the students and workers realised that if they could stage a great big demonstration while Gorbachev was there, the Chinese leadership wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So I went there just thinking it was going to be a routine Gorbachev story, but it wasn't, as you know, and I was there for a month and hardly slept. I learned how to sleep on 2 hours, to survive on 2 hours a night.
Do you remember anything, particularly anything exciting of those nights or days that you were there during the Tiananmen Square uprising?
Yes, well, I think I was astonished when I first went there, because I had naively assumed that it would just be an Asian Russia, an Asian Moscow, as it were, because I've been to Moscow a lot. And I was surprised at certain things, like, for instance, all the students and workers had taken part in the demonstrations had these machines, you know, which would send signals. What do they call them? But which was unbelievable to me. Where in Moscow you couldn't even own a typewriter without a without a license, and I was also surprised at the friendliness that I got from, and we all got from the Chinese students, because they all listened to the BBC, and they, you know, they do what they could to help us.
How did you communicate with them?
Well, a lot of them spoke English, of course. Learned it off the BBC. But also I had a team with me, and I had some excellent translators with me. But most of the time I could speak to them because they knew enough English to be able to communicate. But I suppose, going back to your original question about one of the most exciting moments, I think, was when we heard that the troops were being moved into the outskirts of Beijing. And so I got a taxi, and this was another amazing thing. You could get in a taxi in Beijing and they wouldn't be alarmed, whereas in Moscow you were a foreigner and they didn't really care much. They certainly wouldn't help you out. Whereas when I said to this taxi driver, who spoke a little English, that I heard the troops had turned up and they were on the other side of the Great Wall of China, he said, "Oh, I'll take you there, I'll take you there." So he took me to the Great Wall of China, and we got up to one of those tourist viewing spots. And
did you have your camera with you?
Well, there were, you know, one of those tourist telescopes, but it was on the wrong side. It was looking down onto the city, whereas we could see on the other side that were all the troops. So between the two of us, we dragged this telescope across the other side. Now, how we never got arrested, I do not know, but we had a beautiful view of all the troops gathering there.
Very interesting. We need to take a break, and then when we come back, we will go back to China.
Fine.
Thank you for being with us. We'll be back after this very short break. Thank you. Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking to our distinguished guest today, Mr. Ian D. Richardson, formerly of BBC. We were talking about his time in China and those very momentous days of Tiananmen Square uprising. Yes, Ian. How did you get your information from the Chinese? Because I understand that they don't speak much of English.
Well, of course, I did have people who spoke perfect Chinese.
Mandarin or Cantonese?
Yes, and there were some of the correspondents who worked in China or visited China regularly. They spoke very good Chinese, but also a lot of the Chinese wanted to try their English out on you,
Right,
so
yes.
you were able to communicate like that. But of course, the government officials never told us anything. That wasn't in their nature, and they still don't.
Right. Can we just for a moment go back to the Great Wall where we left to see? You said you turned around the telescope. I wanted and had a grand view of the square where everything was happening.
Well, it was fantastic to be able to have confirmation that the troops were gathering there, and the taxi driver was game for anything, and he said to me, "I'll take you down there," and I thought, my word, should I? At any rate, being a journalist, you can't resist a first-hand experience, so off we went, and as we drove down towards the camp, suddenly two soldiers stepped out and pulled us up, and I thought, my word, we're in trouble now. At any rate, they engaged in some conversation with the taxi driver, which I couldn't understand, and eventually we were waved on, and I said to him, well, what happened? He said, it's all right. He said, they only wanted a lift. And I told them, well, I couldn't do that because there was a foreigner in the back seat. So we were waved on. And so we drove right up to the camp and around it, turned around and went back and reported what we'd seen.
Great. Did you really witness the uprising? The tanks came and
no. I missed that bit of it because by that time I'd been there for a month, and the new team was brought in, so I didn't see, but it was very, very upsetting when I learnt about it. Yes.
Right. See, you said that you had your own people there. Probably informers. Those days?
The correspondents who were there, some of them were there permanently, and some of them I brought in with me on the team. I mean, they were very clever men, and there was also a woman who was extremely well informed, and so they were getting all the information. Our worry was that we wouldn't be able to get it back to London, because what was happening was that, if the Chinese didn't like things, they just cut people off. Now, in the BBC's permanent bureau, there was a studio. It was a very small radio studio connected on a fixed line to London, which was very vulnerable because, of course, it could be cut off at any time. So we were worried about that, and then we pondered what we might do, and the staff correspondent at the time took me upstairs and showed me around what else they had, and I said, "Is there any other? Have you got a fax machine?" He said, "Well, that's an odd story." He said, "We've been given permission to have a fax machine, and they've put a fax line in, but they won't let the fax machine through customs, so they're playing games with us." And I said, "Well, show me the fax line," and he showed me, and I said, "A fax line is just is also a phone line." And he said, "Oh, yes." So we got a phone and plugged it in, and it worked. So what we did for the rest of my time there is we had we dialed London, found we could get straight through, and we locked the line with some equipment. And all the controversial stuff was being sent back over the fax line, and the non-controversial stuff was done out of the normal
Yes,
studio.
so-
And the Chinese never, ever rumbled what we've been
So
doing.
they were foxed.
Well, yes.
That was a good idea, yes, using the fax line for phone, see. uh, you have had different positions in BBC, head of World Service, foreign correspondence, founding editor of BBC World TV, and founding...
As a founding editor,
Yes.
there were three of us. Yes.
and founding managing editor of BBC Arabic TV.
That's right.
Did you find any particular difficulty? I mean, what sort of audience you will be reaching, the listeners you will be reaching in the Arab world, because different regimes react differently to BBC.
Well, they didn't like us. They being
Yeah, yeah.
most of the Arab world, any sort of dictatorship didn't
Right.
like us at all. It was a very strange deal that the BBC did, with their fingers crossed, hoping that it would work. It did sort of for a little while, but our problem was that the original BBC Arabic television, the one that I set up, was transmitted via Orbit Television, which is Saudi owned, and we were told when this contract was done that to go through Orbit that there'd be no interference in BBC. They understood that it was truly independent and would insist on independence. However, they would object to anything that was what they considered culturally insensitive.
Right.
Well, of course, that covered all sorts of things. I mean, we had tremendous trouble with them complaining about almost everything. You know, a lot of the stuff would be fairly well known. You know, they didn't like seeing women in swimwear. They
Right.
didn't like seeing women driving cars. They didn't like.
You also had problem with that film, Death of a Princess.
Well, that's what I was coming to, because Death of the Princess was the death of Arabic television, Mark I, because once that went out against the strongest objections to the Saudi Arabians, we were then shut down. I was phoned at 7:30 in the morning one Sunday and told by a correspondent in Jerusalem that we'd gone. The signal had been disappeared off the satellite and wouldn't be coming back. So I had the very unfortunate and unpleasant experience of being told to go in that afternoon and shut the system down. Now, the irony of all this was the Saudis, having hated the idea that of Arabic television because it insisted on being independent, accidentally contributed to the fact that Al Jazeera got off the ground, because Al Jazeera was having trouble getting started because there weren't that many journalists around who were skilled enough in what we would call our form of television.
Yep.
And so they were having great difficulties. Suddenly, when Arabic television was shut down, there was 150 people, journalists, producers, editors, and on the market. And a great many of them, the most talented ones, went to Doha, and suddenly Al Jazeera got started.
Right.
So, and you know, without the collapse of Arabic television, the Mark I, because I have to say Arabic television has since been revived and is working very well. Without that, they would have, Al Jazeera might not have happened, or certainly would not have happened in the form that it did.
Well, there's always something comes up after something goes down. You see. So
That's right.
So Al Jazeera came up, and now they have a Sky Arabic too, isn't it? A Sky television also has an Arabic broadcast.
Well, there is a lot of Arabic television now, and it has been transformed, because when Arabic television was being started, you know, a lot of these television stations, the government television stations, they were, to put it bluntly, extremely boring, because they would always start the day with what the king or the prime minister or someone else had been doing, regardless of whether they'd been doing anything interesting or not.
Probably they didn't do anything interesting, so there was nothing to report.
Well, if they did anything interesting, they weren't going to tell their viewers and listeners. No.
I know, I remember, because I was there for some time, and when the satellites came, obviously I had 2 satellite dishes just on the top of my house, see, and I could probably see anything anywhere in the world, see. And the restrictions went down the drain, because you could see anything. And they're playing cat and mouse game. They would come and sometimes dismantle the satellite and then go away, and then people will come up again, and then they'll do it. And it was a business, see. Yes. But now everything has been normalized. You can sit there and watch anything and everything almost on your computer, laptop.
Well, that's right. I mean, it'd be an impossible job to suppress it all, but it was astonishing back then in the mid-1990s how bad a lot of this television was. I mean, I'll tell you a little story. I was in Beirut, where we were recruiting staff and so forth, and the Lebanese were very keen to get the BBC back into Beirut, into Lebanon, permanently, because they all had to leave. All the BBC people had to leave because it was so dangerous. And it was astonishing that when we first of all went to the information minister, who then said, well, you must meet the president. I thought, oh, well, okay. So we went to see the president, and the president said to us, well, we'd really love the BBC to set up a bureau here. And he said, you must go and see Mr. Hariri, who was later assassinated. So, you know, without any preamble, we were taken straight to the Prime Minister's office. One of the Arabs I had working with me said to me, do you realise if a bomb went off now, it would wipe out the entire Lebanese cabinet? And they were all waiting to see Mr. Hariri, and we were ahead of the queue, and we talked to him, and as we walked in, I was followed in by cameramen, and it was filmed. And I was told that it was the lead story on their main bulletin, and I thought, my word, really? Really?
That's a good PR for BBC.
Story? No wonder nobody wants to watch it.
But finally, unfortunately, Rafiq Hariri was bombed away.
Yes, that's right. And of course, his son is having troubles as well.
Yes. Apart from this very interesting story about Beirut, did you come across other famous names like Robert Fisk in Beirut? He was stationed there. He used to report for Independent, Right for Independent.
Yes, no, I wasn't there that long. We went there mainly to recruit people, and also the BBC was a bit worried that it was still a bit dangerous and we might be kidnapped, and I didn't want that, and nor did anyone else.
He did a very interesting 4-part series. It's a film for I think Discovery or some other channel, but from Beirut to Bosnia or something.
Yes, and what was his name again? Sorry, what was his name again?
Well, Ian, the time has come for us to take a break again.
Oh, right, okay.
So, don't go away. We'll be back soon after this very short break. Thank you. Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking to our guest today, Ian Richardson, about many things, particularly how the media has changed over the years since Ian has started typing away his stories on his dad's typewriter. How do you find it different?
Oh, well, I think it's enormously different because there was a time, not that many decades ago, where people primarily got their news from newspapers, which isn't the case now. And of course, television was very slow to react often. Radio was all right. Radio was often the fastest of the mediums, but of course it didn't go into any into detail. And it has been transformed primarily, of course, as the result of satellites and the internet and so forth. I mean, the papers that we produced, my family produced, were weekly newspapers. And I know that in some of the neighbouring newspapers, if they were full one week, they'd leave a story over to the next week. Well, you wouldn't do that these days because it'd be out there on Twitter, on the internet, all of these other means. And I remember when I first worked in television in 1980, I mean, the news was actually, a lot of it was yesterday's news because you would be getting film in from wherever there were trouble spots in Middle East, South America, places like that. You had to get the film in and it'd be flown in. Nowadays, of course, satellites are so cheap and they just get everything comes in instantly. And so it's very live, and it has transformed. And of course, the people who are suffering the most are the newspapers.
Yes, back to the telephone line in your picking office.
Yes, that's right.
Your two books, one is God's Triangle, and the other one is Mortal Maze.
Yes.
Mortal Maze is a thriller packed with electrifying twists and turns.
I hope so, at any rate.
Is it, as I asked you before, does this book contain any element of your own life, Sisi?
Well, I suppose inevitably it must, because one of the things you learn when you start writing books and indeed writing features for newspapers is that you give away a lot of yourself,
right?
Often unconsciously. So, I mean, The Mortal Maze is a thriller, and the issue about it is the morality that the moral challenges that people face when they're working as correspondents, particularly those working abroad. So there is, I would not have been able to write that book successfully if I hadn't been in charge of foreign correspondence and knew the way they operated and been out in the field myself and seen what the challenges are. So, yes, inevitably there is quite a bit in it. Some people who I work with think they recognise some of the characters in the book. Well, I couldn't possibly comment.
Somewhere I read that a combination of TV foreign correspondents has a weakness exploited by Western intelligence services with unexpected and disastrous consequences. Disastrous. I mean, the intelligence services.
It wasn't a disaster. Wasn't so much disastrous for the intelligence services. It was disastrous for the main character, the correspondent, because I don't think it spoils the story too much to say that the correspondent had a gambling weakness, and this made him incredibly vulnerable. And so the story is all about how he wants to be a famous, highly respected correspondent, but he's got this problem. He keeps finding himself broke and getting himself into financial troubles. And the trouble is that one of his former university friends knows about this, and his friend's now working for the intelligence services. So it's a constant struggle all the time between his desire to be a good, honest, honourable correspondent and the problems he faces of always being broke and always getting himself into debt. And I think that happens. I mean, I'm not naming or suggesting there is anyone like, but this would happen in life, not just in journalism.
Yep. In many circumstances, it can happen.
Yes, of course.
So was it like a mission impossible?
Yes. Well, I think it's got a positive end, but it is a very difficult end to the story.
How was it received?
Well, very well. I've had some wonderful reviews, and it's yet to make me rich and famous. But you know,
you're famous already. See?
Yes. Well, there is an old joke. You know, someone says someone is a household name, but only in his own household. Well,
that goes for me.
That's right.
Let's get to the second book of yours, which is probably much more interesting than the other one, the thriller.
Well, it certainly would for your audience, I
Yes.
think, because it is set in
Right.
East Bengal, as it
Right.
then was.
Right. Tell us this God's Triangle. You've got an edition paperback and also an e-book. It's about Florrie
Yes,
Cox.
yeah. Well, Florence Cox was my great aunt, and she was married to a missionary going out. She became engaged to a missionary going out to.
And this is not fiction. This is fact.
Sorry, I should say that this is absolutely fact, because this book is all about me trying to find out what happened to Auntie Florrie, because she wasn't talked about in the family, and it's only when my mother and I were going through some really old photographs, there was this photograph of a woman I didn't recognise. When I said to her, "Who is this?" she said, "Oh, it's Auntie Florrie," and I asked why, why I'd never heard of her. She said, "Oh well, we didn't talk about her much. It was a bit of a problem." I don't, nobody ever told me about it. But the more being a journalist, the more I asked her, the more she revealed, and that Florrie had become engaged to a missionary going to Mymensingh. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, Mymensingh, yes.
And 2 years later, she joined him and got married immediately. But there was a gender problem which she hadn't recognised, and never really knew about throughout her life, which meant that the marriage was a disaster. And it's a very, very sad story about how she has to deal with something that she doesn't understand. So does her husband have to deal with something that he doesn't understand, knowing that he wanted children but they could never have children. And at the side was another missionary who fell in love with my great aunt's husband, and so that's where the God's Triangle comes in, the three-way relationship. And so it's a very sad story, but it's I think that one of the things that that's pleased me about it was that one of the people I spoke to, a specialist who was dealing with gender issues, bought stacks of the book to distribute to medical schools around the world saying you should read this book so that you can understand what happens with people who have these gender, difficulties. These, I mean, to put it frankly, my aunt was identified eventually as being intersex.
Yeah.
And it's always a very difficult issue, and certainly within a very religious
Obviously,
family.
those days it was so difficult to understand.
Well, it's still difficult in some respects, in
Yeah.
some parts of the world, of course.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, I see. But the society here, the Western society here, is more open, and they understand.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
this.
things have certainly improved,
Yeah.
but it's a very sad story. But people who've read it seem to find it very interesting.
I read somewhere that there's going to be a film based on this book.
Well, we've come close-ish. There were some producers who wanted to do it and raised money for it and so forth. But what I didn't like was how the story was being told, because I'd written the script and I felt that the script was being tampered with, so that it was basically it would have been an insult to my great aunt and misrepresented
Right.
what life was like in East Bengal. So I withdrew from that, but then the people who produced the wonderful film called Lion, set in India and Tasmania, they were very keen on it. But when Lion became such a popular film, and
Yeah.
so, they were swamped with other projects, and they said, "Look, we'd love to do it. It's a great film. It must be told, but we don't think we're going to be able to get to do it." So I never give up. I just keep trying. So
Right.
if you know anyone with $10 million, let me know.
Well, okay. Anybody listening with $10 million to spare, please contact Mr. Ian Richardson. We are almost near the end of the show. I have nothing more to say but to thank you very much from the core of my heart for making time for us. And one thing that was left to discuss is, do you see the death of print media in the near future?
Very hard to say. Very hard to say, but it's certainly changing. Certainly changing. But look, see, I'm old enough to have been through the age where television came, and
Yeah.
they said television's going to wipe out radio.
Right.
It hasn't.
No.
It's just changed,
True.
and radio is just as powerful as television is.
So print media might make a comeback.
It'll be different, but yes.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say it's finished by any means.
Ian, thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure. Very
It was
nice
a pleasure
to meet
and an
you.
honor. Thank you. Thank you. Before I sign off, I want to congratulate and share the happiness of the month of December, the month of joy, the month of victory for Bangladeshis all over the world. And also I wanted to share the good news that your favorite channel, NTV, is doing very well at Bob, and the figures released by the authorities are nothing but that have made us joyful, and we hope that you will continue to support us in future as you have been doing in the past, and we'll continue to serve you because we are with you and we are for you. Thank you very much for being with us. We hope that you have enjoyed the show as much as we have. See you again next week, same time, same channel. Bye for now.